There is a fantasy many survivors carry long after the relationship ends, and sometimes long after they have stopped saying that person's name out loud. It is not always obvious at first, because it hides inside more respectable thoughts. Maybe one day they'll understand. Maybe one day the performance will crack. Maybe one day they'll stop blaming everyone else, stop running from themselves, and finally see the truth. And buried inside all of that is one deeper wish, the one that hurts the most to admit. Maybe one day they will finally realize what is missing inside them, and that realization will change everything. Because if they could finally feel it, really feel it, then maybe they would stop punishing you for it. Maybe they would stop using people the way they do. Maybe they would stop reaching for admiration, control, sex, image, status, or emotional domination the way a drowning person reaches for air. Maybe they would understand that the thing they kept trying to pull out of you was never something you actually had to give. And maybe then, finally, the story would end differently than it did. But the reality is usually darker than that. When someone built around narcissistic defenses begins to sense that the emptiness inside them is not temporary, not situational, and not something another person can permanently soothe, what often begins is not healing. It is panic. It is the moment the system they built to outrun themselves stops working well enough to protect them from themselves. And that matters, because a person can get much closer to the truth without becoming any safer for the people around them. Now, to be careful and accurate, that word void is not a formal diagnosis, and it should not be used as some dramatic shortcut to make every difficult person sound clinically identical. But as survivors use it, the word points to something real enough, a kind of inner instability, a chronic inability to feel solid for very long, a dependence on outside reinforcement to maintain a sense of self that otherwise starts slipping. That is why the outer confidence can be so misleading. The polished voice, the certainty, the superiority, the contempt, the certainty that they are the prize, the certainty that everyone else is foolish, jealous, weak, or disposable. On the surface it looks like power. Underneath, it may be doing the very opposite. It may be working like scaffolding, holding something upright that does not know how to stand on its own. Clinical sources describe narcissistic pathology in exactly this paradoxical way: grandiose presentation, deep need for admiration, and a fragile self-esteem that reacts intensely to criticism, exclusion, and failure. That is why the relationship can feel so confusing. You are not relating to a stable inner person who sometimes acts badly. You may be relating to a person whose inner equilibrium depends on what the environment is feeding back to them. When they are admired, mirrored, desired, obeyed, idealized, envied, or allowed to feel superior, they can appear almost effortless, or even charming, playful, big, alive. But when something interrupts that flow, when they are criticized, ignored, not chosen, contradicted, exposed, outperformed, abandoned, or simply not centered, the shift can feel immediate and shocking. Suddenly the person who seemed untouchable is raging, sulking, punishing, lying, rewriting, withdrawing, or hunting for a way to restore the upper hand. That is not random inconsistency. It is regulation. It is a self trying to restore altitude. And once you see that, a lot of their relational behaviors stop looking mysterious. The love bombing is not just affection. It can be acquisition. The control is not just cruelty. It can be terror in disguise. The image management is not just vanity. It can be life support. The devaluation is not just meanness. It can be what happens when another person stops reflecting back the version of self they needed to see. None of this makes the behavior okay. It makes it legible. It gives language to what your nervous system already knew before your mind could explain it. This is also why the public and private versions of them can feel like two different realities stitched into one body. Publicly, they may look composed, talented, confident, socially intelligent, even generous if generosity is serving the image. Privately, they can feel like a vacuum. Insatiable, thin-skinned, domineering, emotionally expensive, able to pull attention into themselves no matter what the room is supposed to be about. Your pain becomes their inconvenience. Your needs become an accusation. Your boundaries become disrespect. Your exhaustion becomes proof that you are selfish, dramatic, unstable, or impossible to please. To outside people, that contradiction is hard to grasp because they are only seeing the part of the system that works. You are the one seeing what happens when it doesn't. And that is where a lot of survivors get trapped for years, because when you are close to someone like this, it is very easy to start believing you are standing beside a deep well of hidden pain that only needs enough love, patience, insight, and loyalty to finally become reachable. You start thinking in terms of access. If I say it more gently, if I stop reacting, if I become more understanding, if I survive this phase, if I stop triggering their shame, if I can just get past the defenses, I will finally meet the real person underneath. But that hope can quietly turn you into a regulator. It can turn your love into labor, your empathy into fuel, and your entire identity into a support beam for someone else's unstable internal world. That is why this topic lands so hard. Because what many survivors secretly want is not revenge. It is not even justice. It is the relief of knowing that one day the person who made them feel so disposable, so unseen, so distorted, will finally understand what they were actually doing. One day the narcissist will realize that all the power games, the triangulation, the seductive returns, the cold punishments, the contempt, the image management, the emotional theft, all of it came from a place they could not outrun forever. And if that day comes, maybe it means the survivor did not suffer in a vacuum. Maybe it means the truth finally arrived. But truth arriving inside a person and transformation following it are not the same event. And this is where so much of the pain lives. Because when a narcissistically organized person starts sensing that the old methods are not solving the problem anymore, the result is often not relief. It is threat. If admiration doesn't last, if new people don't last, if professional success doesn't last, if sexual conquest doesn't last, if winning doesn't last, if dominating one more conversation, humiliating one more partner, or collecting one more admirer still leaves the same dead air beneath it all, then what they are coming up against is not disappointment in one relationship. It is disappointment in the entire strategy. And a person can react to that in very different ways. One way is escalation, more attention-seeking, more control, more spending, more image, more dramatic self-reinvention, more provocative behavior, more affairs, more emotional extraction, more attempts to pull former partners back into orbit. Because if the previous dose stopped working, the next instinct is often not to quit the drug. It is to increase it. That is why some people seem to become more demanding, not less, as they get older or more exposed. They are not mellowing into wisdom. They are trying harder to get the old machinery to produce the same effect it once did. Another way is rage. And this is where survivors often make one of the most costly mistakes, because they assume that if the person is finally in touch with their emptiness, that awareness will humble them. But shame does not always produce reflection. Sometimes it produces attack. Sometimes the person who feels most internally defeated becomes the most externally punishing, because anger lets them move the feeling outward. Shame says, something is wrong with me. Rage says, no, something is wrong with you, and you will carry this. The shame-rage literature on vulnerable narcissism supports exactly this pattern. Disappointment, threat, or negative feedback can trigger anger as a way of protecting an unstable sense of self. So when the void gets closer, the person may not open. They may lash out. And then there is the return. The haunting return. The text that comes out of nowhere. The strange softness. The late-night confession. The sudden memory. The almost believable sadness. This is the version that confuses survivors the most, because it can feel so intimate. So exposed. So close to truth. The person sounds tired now. Deflated. Haunted. They say things like nothing makes them happy anymore, or nobody understands them, or they feel empty no matter what they do, or they lost the best thing they ever had, or they have finally started to see what they were running from. And maybe some part of that is even true. But the question is never whether the feeling is real in that moment. The question is what function the confession is serving. Because a confession can still be manipulative. Pain can be real and still be used. Collapse can be authentic and still be dangerous if the point of showing it is to recruit you back into regulation. If the display of inner brokenness still asks you to carry them, reassure them, absolve them, return to them, soften your boundaries, or forget the pattern that brought you here, then the collapse has not become accountability. It has become a new costume for dependency and control. That is one of the hardest truths in these dynamics. Authenticity in flashes does not equal safety in patterns. There is another version of realization that is even colder. Instead of becoming dramatic or confessional, the person becomes efficient, stripped down, less romantic about their own mask, less invested in pretending love means mutuality, more openly transactional. They may still perform charm, but now it feels mechanical, tactical. They are no longer trying to believe another person will nourish them in some deep way. They are simply sorting people by function. Who stabilizes the image? Who supplies attention? Who offers status? Who can be used for sex, admiration, logistics, access, rescue, or emotional dumping? In this phase, intimacy becomes less like connection and more like inventory. For the person on the receiving end, that can be devastating because it exposes a truth you were trying not to know. You were not only loved imperfectly, you may have been assigned a role. Audience, caretaker, regulator, container, witness, scapegoat, supplier of reassurance, supplier of drama, supplier of forgiveness, supplier of the feeling that they mattered. And once you stop serving the role, what returns may not be grief in the way you understand grief. It may be resentment that the function has been lost. It may be panic that the system has lost a stabilizer. It may be envy that you have become harder to access. It may be fury that you no longer agree to disappear into their needs. This is why a narcissist, realizing the void is permanent, should never be romanticized. Survivors are often tempted to turn that moment into a kind of tragic redemption arc. Finally, the all-powerful person meets the truth. Finally, the mask slips. Finally, they understand why they kept hurting people. Finally, the pain they caused catches up to them in some morally satisfying way. But inner suffering is not moral clarity. A person can feel empty and still be exploitative. A person can feel broken and still be cruel. A person can recognize their own instability and still recruit other people to manage it for them. There is nothing automatically ethical about suffering. Sometimes suffering only deepens a person's self-absorption if they are still organized around avoiding responsibility. That is also why outside observers often get this wrong. They see distress and assume depth. They see tears and assume insight. They see collapse and assume conscience. But the real test is never the emotional weather of the moment. It is structure. What do they do when the feeling passes? Do they sustain accountability when there is no applause for it? Do they tell the truth when the truth costs them their image? Do they stop retaliating against the people who see through them? Do they tolerate being ordinary? Do they remain in treatment? Do they stop using closeness as extraction? Do they show any growing capacity to recognize another person's inner life when that inner life does not revolve around them? That is where change lives. Not in the confession, in the pattern that follows it. And real change, if it happens, is not grand. It is humiliating in quiet ways. It means tolerating shame without converting it into attack. It means surviving criticism without rewriting the entire story. It means grieving the idealized self instead of constantly refurbishing it. It means learning to need without disguising need as superiority, entitlement, contempt, or helplessness that manipulates other people into service. It means discovering that being loved is not the same as being worshipped, and that intimacy cannot survive where control is treated like oxygen. Treatment can help, but clinical sources are clear that outcome depends heavily on willingness, and many people with these patterns do not seek treatment unless other problems force the issue. So where does that leave the survivor? It leaves them in front of the most painful reframe of all. You were never supposed to be enough. Not because you were lacking, but because the role you were being asked to play was impossible. No human being can permanently stabilize another person's fragmented self-worth without disappearing in the process. You could have been more patient, more articulate, more forgiving, more attractive, more available, more spiritual, more sexually open, less reactive, more admiring, less threatening, more compliant, and it still would not have resolved the central problem. Because the central problem was not your failure to love. It was their dependence on being regulated from the outside. And that is why so many survivors feel both grief and relief when this finally clicks. Grief, because it means the fantasy dies. The fantasy that one more conversation, one more chance, one more season of compassion, one more heroic act of understanding could finally produce the person you kept hoping to meet. Relief, because it means you can stop measuring your worth by your ability to rescue someone from an emptiness that was there long before you and would still be there if you returned. The relationship may have trained you to think your job was to decode them, calm them, predict them, soften them, hold them together, and absorb what they could not bear to feel. But that was never love in its healthiest sense. That was unpaid psychological labor dressed up as devotion. And maybe the darkest part is this. The moment they realize the void is not going away may have very little to do with love at all. It may have more to do with aging, failure, loss of beauty, public exposure, a diminishing audience, repeated relational breakdown, or the slow horror of discovering that the same script keeps producing the same ending. The admirers leave. The new person stops working. The old tricks lose potency. The image gets harder to sustain. They can feel themselves becoming repetitive even to themselves. And in that quiet, when the stimulation falls away, what remains can be deeply unnerving. Not because they suddenly become monsters in their own eyes, but because they may finally sense that all this time they were building strategies, not a self. That is why some narcissistic people seem to become more frantic with age while others become more bitter, more isolated, or more openly exploitative. The crisis is not always dramatic, but it is often structural. The old narcotic loses strength. And once that happens, the person may search harder for people to regulate them, punish those who fail, or collapse into a kind of sterile despair where nothing feels nourishing because nothing was ever being metabolized in the first place. Everything was being used to patch a leak. Nothing was being integrated. If you lived with someone like this, then you already know how exhausting it is to be near a hunger that has no language for itself. You feel it in the way the room bends around them. In the way ordinary limits turn into personal insults. In the way your joy can become a threat if it does not include them. In the way your calm can provoke them because it reminds them they are not in command of your emotional climate anymore. In the way their need can arrive wearing different clothes every week. Seduction, fragility, anger, accusation, brilliance, crisis, victimhood, silence, but underneath it all there is the same demand. Regulate me without ever naming that as the demand. So if a narcissist finally realizes their internal void is permanent, what it means is not simple and it is certainly not romantic. It may mean the illusion is cracking. It may mean the old supplies are no longer numbing them the way they once did. It may mean they are entering a phase of harder control, sharper rage, colder detachment, or more desperate return attempts. It may mean they are standing at the first miserable edge of real change. But unless that realization is followed by responsibility, humility, sustained treatment, and a growing ability to stop using other people as emotional equipment, then what you are really watching is not redemption. You are watching a person become more aware of the hunger that has always been there. And your work is not to feed it one last time. Your work is to let the fantasy die with dignity. To understand that the deepest truth in this story is not that they were secretly emptier than they looked. It is that you were never responsible for filling what could not be filled by another person. That is the part many survivors never hear clearly enough, so let it land now. Their emptiness was not proof of your purpose. Their hunger was not proof of your assignment. Their collapse was not proof that you needed to go back. Their late insight, if it ever comes, does not rewrite what it cost you to stand too close to it. Because sometimes the most healing thing you can understand is not that they finally saw the void. It is that you finally stopped mistaking it for your job.